he is not yet married, because that's going to happen in the next chapter. Spoiler alert. So that's the situation. That's what's going on with them. That means probably about a decade or more has passed since Genesis chapter 22. We're not given really any timestamp for Genesis 22 when exactly it happened, but there are some clues to us as to Isaac's capabilities. He has to be at least a certain age. He's able to carry the wood up the mountain himself. He's able to reason, sort of the issues with the sacrifice that Abraham is trying to do here in Genesis chapter 22. So he's got some agency of some kind. We're not given a lot of detail aside from that, but it seems that a significant amount of time has passed here. My guess is about a decade or so at least, maybe more. Again, we're not exactly sure, but we do get a timestamp here for where we are now. Now, the other important thing we want to mention is where she dies. And your translations may say a slightly different name. Mine is Kiriath Arba. That is Hebron. So I think that was the original name, and it's one of those instances where Hebron would be the name later, but it's called that, so the Israelites who are reading it will understand where that place is. So she dies in Hebron. Now, this is not super, surprising, because how many times do we read about Abraham and he's in the area of Hebron? Several chapters he's hanging out in the Hebron area. Now, the only thing that is worth noting here is that before this, he has been in the area down south in Beersheba. If you remember the last couple chapters we've been studying, he's been farther south. So at some point between Genesis chapter 22 and Genesis chapter 23, they went back up to Hebron. Now, we're not exactly sure all the details of that, but that must have happened, otherwise she wouldn't have died there. So he's relocated to that area of Hebron. So those are a couple things that help us set the stage for where we are now, understanding where we are in time, understanding where Abraham is geographically. They're back in Hebron. Some significant amount of time has passed between this chapter and the last chapter by the time Sarah dies. Any thoughts or comments on those first two verses before we move on? Okay. It's hard to break this chapter up because it flows very well. It's a great narrative. But I'm going to break it up a little bit. Someone read for us verses 3 through 9, please. 3 through 9. Okay, thank you. So Abraham goes before, we're going to talk about this. He goes before the Hittites and speaks to them. Now, some of your translations, I believe the one that Buddy read from, calls them the sons of Heth or the descendants of Heth. We're talking about the same people here. This is not like a translation issue. It's just how they decided to translate it. We're talking about the same group. If you go back in Genesis chapter 10, this is where we have, again, the table of nations. If you go through the line of Ham, you have from Ham to Canaan, and then his son is Heth. Now, some of your translations, instead of, even in Genesis 10, instead of calling it Heth, it'll call it the Hittites. It's the same people. It's the same group. It's not a translation error. It's like if we translated it, instead of the Israelites, it'd be the sons of Israel or the sons of Jacob. It'd be the same thing. In fact, we say the children of Israel. We mean the Israelites. We kind of understand that one pretty well. This may be a little less common, but it's the same kind of thing going on. So sons of Heth, Hittites, same thing. Don't get confused on that. I'm going to say Hittites because that's what my translation uses, and that's what I put in my notes. So if I say Hittites, I'm referring to the sons of Heth or descendants of Heth. Hopefully we don't get too confused about that. Now, there's a couple other things to talk about here. He says he speaks to the sons of Heth or the Hittites. I don't think he's speaking to the entire nation. My guess is presumably it's the leaders in that area that he's speaking to. Otherwise, this would be like a huge crowd, because any of you who are familiar in archaeology would know that the Hittites were one of the first great empires of the world. They're up there with Egypt. They're one of the very first empires that have any significant sway in that area. Now, there's kind of another thing, and this is sort of in the background, not really talked about, and I don't really know how far to go with it. But if you remember earlier chapters, like chapter 14, when Abraham is in this area, he's made an alliance with some guys who we believe are Amorites. Well, now they're not mentioned here, but now the Hittites are here. So to me, it almost indicates that there's been a shift in the political arena, that the Amorites have been pushed out maybe a little bit, and the Hittites are now in and have taken control of some of this land. I don't know how much to go off of with just this. That's a little bit of an assumption, so don't take that to heart, but that could be a possibility. Otherwise, why is he talking to the Hittites and he's not talking to the Amorites? Just a thought on that. That could be a whole study in itself, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole today. But just something to kind of take a look at in your own time if you'd like. So he's making a request here, Abraham is, to the Hittites, that they will allow him to buy some property to bury his dead, to bury Sarah. That's who we're talking about, but usually say to bury his dead or to bury the dead. We're talking about Sarah here. That's every indication. That's what makes sense. Now, the Hittites seem to hold Abraham in very high regard. We're going to see this. There's a very respectful exchange between them. And here they call him, and depending on your translation, NIV, King James, New King James will say that they call him a mighty prince among us. The CSB says a prince of God. Translations will say something along that line. Something that he is well esteemed as a great and powerful man. They respect him. They think he is a good person. And we're going to kind of see how that plays out. The Hittites tell Abraham that none of them are going to refuse his request. You want to buy, one of our land? We're not going to say no. Let us know what you want. Basically, they're very much open to this agreement, so that he can have property for a burial site. Now, Abraham, he's very respectful. He's playing back to this. He's bowing. We see this a couple times. He's paying his respects to them. He bows before them. And he asked that they talk to Ephron, son of Zohar, and ask him to sell to Abraham the cave of Machpelah that is at the edge of his field. So he's apparently got a specific place in mind. He kind of already knows what he wants. He's not sitting there wondering, well, who should I ask, or whose property do I want? He's already got something in mind. I don't know how long he's thought about this ahead of time. We're not given any indication about it. But he knows what he wants. And he is willing to pay the full price. He's not going to, even though he's held in high regard, he doesn't want the family discount or anything like that. He wants to pay the full price for this property. And that's we'll get to kind of the interaction as it goes on, but I wanted to break it up a little bit. Any comments up through verse 9 before we continue on? Y'all, we're going to get through this whole chapter here real quick. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and move on then. Someone read for us. We're going to read the rest of the chapter. Someone read for us verses 10 through 20, please. Okay. So we have a continuation of Abraham's request here to buy property, and depending on your translation here, what are you reading out of, Jeff? Just so I know. New King James. So if you have New King James or some of those, it doesn't quite indicate this maybe as much as other translations like the NIV. The NIV makes it sound like Ephron is there when Abraham is making the request. Like he just happens to be on the site with all the other Hittites who are there. So some of the translations may word it a little differently, saying that, maybe indicating that he's there and he's able to give an answer right away, or maybe he was just able to get there quickly. It's really, we're splitting hairs. I don't have too much. Go ahead, Jeff. They're in his city, but was he there when Abraham was talking? He may have been dwelling there and they went and got him and brought him back. I don't really know how to, the way it's translated doesn't necessarily indicate he was in that assembly at that moment. The NIV kind of indicates that, but he was certainly there in that area where the Hittites were. That's the distinction I'm making. There's not really much to go off of that. It's not a big deal, but he's able to come and speak to Abraham directly. So there's not so much this intercession of he's got to have a third party go talk to Ephron saying, hey, Abraham wants to buy your field. Do you want to sell it? It seems to indicate that at some point they came face to face and they were talking terms directly to each other. That's how I come to understand it, that he did go there or was there at some point and was able to talk to Abraham about this. Go ahead.
It seems to me this whole thing is very formal.
Oh, yes.
Even though Ephron is there, it seems to be there present, as well as the Hittites. They're all there together, I sense,
Mm-hmm.
but they're speaking to one another very formally. They're not kind of speaking collectively. They're addressing each one individually by name, speaking of the other guy who's standing right there. That's the impression I get. But it is because of the gravity of the situation, and obviously Abraham is in mourning. This is all to honor Sarah, his wife, that he shared so much of his life with. And he's being very formal, very deliberate to honor her.
And also it may be because they seem to have good relationship going on, because they're not going to refuse. They say, any of us will sell to you. We're not going to refuse Abraham your request at all. Just tell us what you want. And so they've called him a prince among us. There seems to be very good respect between them before this situation even happened. So we don't know how that came to be between Genesis chapter 22 and 23, but every indication is they created a good relationship with each other and were on good terms. Go ahead, Arnold. You had your hand up.
Yes, I was just going to say that I believe the reason it sort of flows the way it does, that everybody is, available. He was, as you mentioned, he was a prince among the people.
Mm-hmm.
He was well known, and I think an event as such as the death of a person of his status would have drawn people together.
Yeah, and there seems to be more than just them knowing that he's a great and powerful man, because we've seen that recognized by other people that he's encountered, but they always haven't been on good terms. But they've always recognized that God is with him and he's powerful and there's things going on. Pharaoh of Egypt recognized that, but told him to scram and get out and don't come back. So you get different reactions, but there seems to be not just a respect in terms of power, but a respect in terms of you're a good man, you're a God-fearing man, and we want to help you in this time where you're mourning the death of your wife. So there's a good relationship going on here, more than just a respect out of power. Yeah, absolutely.
He's a fair man. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
he would sort of gravitate toward people that seem to be fair.
Yeah. It's easier to get along with people who are like that. I see another hand up. Buddy, go ahead.
Yes, I'm in agreement with Jeff. It does seem like it's very formal.
Mm-hmm.
And you can sense that Abraham doesn't want to be owing to them in any way. And then, when Abraham's adamant about he's going to pay, it's almost like, we really don't want to take your money, but if we did, it's worth $400.
Yeah. We'll get into that a little bit more. I've got that in my notes. But and this is not something we haven't seen before. If you remember back to Genesis, I think 14, where he goes after the four-king coalition and brings back all the spoils and the plunder. And the king of Sodom meets him, and he says, give me the people back, and you can keep the rest. And he says, no, I don't want you being able to say that I made Abraham rich. Now, I think Abraham probably had an issue with the king of Sodom personally because of the way Sodom was going at that time, even before its destruction. There may be some more to that than that, but Abraham is not one to owe anything to anybody. Now, he has received gifts. That's not something he doesn't do ever. We see that with Abimelech, king of Gerar, and Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He receives gifts from them. But that situation's a little bit different. God was interceding there. I don't want to get bogged down in the details, but there are some interesting things about that. And anything else? Okay, Jeff, go ahead.
I think this is more than, I realize, I think you're right that he does have a desire not to owe others. He's living in a strange land and he doesn't want to seem to be mooching off of it. At the same time, this is the way to honor Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
What is Sarah worth? What is your life worth? Certainly worth 400 shekels of silver or more, whatever the price is. He wants to do things right, correct, in honor of her. And this is what we do. I know people sometimes will pay ridiculous amounts for funerals. It's not because it's often not because they're trying to impress anybody. It's because they want to honor the person that they're burying in. So I think that's got a lot to do with this as well. That he wants to be very careful to do everything just right to show his honor for Sarah.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit more too. There's more to it.
I guess maybe I may be getting a little early too, but now Sarah is honored. She honored Abraham too
Mm-hmm.
in her life. First Peter 3 talks about that. So there was lots of reasons for Abraham to show his appreciation for his good wife.
Any wife that is willing to bear a child at age 90 deserves a little bit of respect, I think.
How about living in a tent all her life,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously joking a little bit, but she was there with Abraham every step of the way of this journey. All the trials that he went through, she was going through at the same time. So yeah, there's a very close bond between them, obviously. Now again, as we mentioned here, Abraham. Oh, go ahead, Arnold. I'll let you go. Go ahead.
Pick up on what Jeff was saying about the field. You would be really, really special person if you got a field to bury one person in. But the thing I'm looking at is this field would be available for future generations.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that more at the end. There's actually a lot to say about this. It comes up again several times in Scripture. Yeah, you all getting ahead of me. Just hold on a second. Abraham, we talked about, he wants to pay the full price of the property. Ephron says it's worth 400 shekels of silver. And he says that's what it's worth, but what's that between you and me? Bury your dead. So he's not really interested in getting that money. He's interested in Abraham's needs being met. That's what he's interested in. So he says that's what the price of it is, but don't worry about it, is what I guess we would probably say in the modern vernacular. It's, this piece of property, it's worth X amount, but, don't worry about it. That's the impression I get. But he pays the full amount. It talks about, the amount that's paid. It even talks about as it being the currency of the merchants or by the weight of the merchants. So it's an exact amount. He's not skimping a little bit. It's not 399. It's 400. It's the full amount. And the purchase is made. The agreement is made. The property Abraham purchases includes this whole field. So there's the cave on that field. There's a few trees that it mentions within its border. And this is done, as we've kind of mentioned before, in a very formal manner. It's witnessed by presumably all the leaders of the Hittites who are there. So everyone is a witness to it. They all see, Ephron has sold his field to Abraham for this amount. This is now Abraham's property. We all recognize that. It is deeded to Abraham. I don't know if they wrote out a receipt or something like that. I'm not sure how that translation would go. but everyone there recognizes this is Abraham's. We all recognize it. We all respect it. We all know it. And that seems to be, there's going to be no argument about whose field is this. This is Abraham's field. There's a couple final interesting notes we've kind of touched on a little bit, but I don't really have any more about the text itself here, but some other things I want to mention before we conclude this chapter. Later on, there are, as Arnold sort of alluded to, there are other people who get buried here at this location. Sarah is, of course, the first one. This is why it is bought by Abraham in the first place. But when we get to Genesis chapter 25, when Abraham dies, he is going to be buried in this location as well. He's also going to be buried there with his wife. And then we get much later on, according to Jacob, this would be Abraham's grandson, his father and mother, Isaac and Rebekah, were buried there. And also he had buried his wife Leah there, not Rachel. We hear about her death. It's a different location. But he buries his wife Leah there. And then he also, at that time, gives instructions to his descendants to bury Jacob there when he dies. After he dies, he wants to be buried there too. So this becomes not just a burial place for Sarah. This is kind of a family burial site now. We have Sarah, we have Abraham, we have Isaac, we have Rebekah, we have Leah, we have Jacob. All of that line, we see the patriarchs and their wives are all buried at this location. So we're not going to get to all those chapters. We'll get to Genesis 25, obviously, but we're not going to get to the point where Jacob is talking about all this. I'm just mentioning it here so that you know that there are more people buried here than just Sarah and just Abraham. This becomes very much a family burial site. The other thing I want to mention here is it's kind of, and I may have mentioned this before, but it's a really interesting thought. We know that Abraham is very blessed by God. He's very faithful. God blesses him in many ways. He has enormous herds. In fact, when you go back to before Abraham and Lot separate, when they get to that point, it says the land could not support both of their herds together. So that's why they had to separate. So we know he has enormous flocks and herds. We know that he has servants or slaves that do a lot of the work. In fact, we know that some of them are trained in some kind of basic warfare. Back in Genesis 14 when they go and fight the 4-king coalition. There are all these things that he has, but like we've mentioned before, he is a wanderer. He is living in tents. The only property he ever owns is a burial site. That is the only property he ever owns. I think that is really interesting. For a couple reasons. I want to, if you want to go ahead of me a little bit, go ahead and start turning to Hebrews chapter 11. I want to read a little bit out of it. Maybe kind of, and I'm not sure, you know, I like to mention when I'm not sure because it dissolves me of any responsibility here. But the Hebrew writer seems to indicate that Abraham was not super interested in property. In fact, that seems to be the case because, again, this is the only property he ever owns. But, you know, God gives him these promises that, you know, all along the way, all from, you know, Genesis chapter 12 onward, he's telling Abraham, you know, you're going to have a great number of descendants. They'll be numerous. You'll not be able to count them. They're going to inherit this land. I'm going to give it to them. But Abraham himself never really sees any of that come to fruition in his lifetime. I don't know how much he understood how that was going to work. I mean, we have obviously seen he doesn't always understand how God works, but he remains faithful to him nonetheless. But Abraham is not interested in doing this on his own. He is not going around seizing the cities of other neighboring countrymen, which he probably could have. I mean, we've seen he's got some warfare capabilities. He's got the riches, he's got the wealth, he's got the manpower. He could do this, but he doesn't do that, aside from this burial site that he purchases. So let's look at Hebrews a little bit. Maybe it'll give us a little bit of insight into his mindset at this time. And of course, it'll kind of recap a lot of the things we've gone through so far in this study. I'm going to read Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 8. I'm going to skip around a little bit. Hebrews 11, starting verse 8, it says, by faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Skipping down to verse 13. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Now, there's more about Abraham here in Hebrews 11. I'm going to stop there. It's really interesting to think about this, these verses that we've read in context of what Abraham has been doing. He came from Ur of the Chaldees, way, way far away, and has come all the way to Canaan. He's been doing all these little journeys here and back, and we've talked about how he's been moving around in that area. And now his wife has died. He's bought a burial plot, of all things, and that's all he's ever going to get in his lifetime. And of course, the Hebrew writer mentions Isaac and Jacob also lived in tents. They were also nomadic. They also didn't buy any additional property. They weren't claiming territory or anything like that. In fact, when we get to the end of Genesis, all of Jacob and his family have moved down to Egypt to be with Joseph. And that's where they're going to remain until several chapters into Exodus, where there's going to be a pretty good chunk of time between Genesis and Exodus where they grow in number, but they've been put into slavery at that point. And it's not until they leave Egypt in the Exodus, they spend 40 years out in the wilderness, then they go and they start actually claiming the land. A huge amount of time passes between the promise to Abraham and when they actually start claiming the land after the Exodus, and you get into the book of Joshua. So all that time, all of what God has promised, saying, your descendants are going to claim this territory, and it's going to be theirs, this land is going to be theirs, takes a very, very long time to happen. But God does follow on his promise. They do get the land. They do claim the land. They do take the land. But God's timetable is not our timetable. And so we would look at this and say, well, Abraham, he just got nothing but a burial site. That's a pretty bad deal after all the things Abraham has done. Abraham wasn't interested in that. He said, God's going to take care of it on his own timetable. He's learned that with Isaac. And he says, I'm looking forward to something better. The Hebrew writer indicates that he's looking forward to a heavenly city, a city built by God. And we don't always really understand how much in the Old Testament they knew about what is heaven, what is the afterlife, because it's not talked about in such great detail as we see in the New Testament. But certainly there was an idea of that. David alludes to that several times. It is not an unknown thing, but Abraham had his priorities right. And I think that's the lesson we're going to learn from this is, goes through all this, gets nothing but a burial site, but he trusts in God. God's going to fulfill that promise in a much later time, in a much later generation, but Abraham's done right through this. Jeff, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
You come to the end of a life in a family, you have a chance to take measure of your life and the impact you've had in this world. It's clear that Abraham is highly regarded by his neighbors, that he's been an honorable man, that he's been a good man. He's made that area better and stronger because he was there. If he was not there, maybe some despot would take his place and harass the people and things like that. But he was a good man, and he did a good thing. And so, yeah, he didn't have a lot of land, but what he had was more valuable than that. I really think that most everyone on their deathbed would rather take good friends and people who would honor you like this than they would the knowledge that they had a bunch of land that they're fixing to give to their descendants,
Yeah, you can't take it with you, that kind of thing. Yeah.
But you can't really measure a good life by your possessions. You could have gotten them by hook or crook. You can measure your life by relationships. And Abraham had lived a good he had his priorities right, and as you said, yeah, you know, it would have been nice if it had a house and maybe a large house and things like that, but he didn't worry about those things. What he had was very precious.
Yeah, he was interested in following God. That's what he was wanting to do.
Never be alone.
Mm.
They always have people that will support them and help them and appreciate them.
Yeah, and we'll probably talk about that more when we get to Genesis chapter 25 when Abraham dies. We're gonna stop here, but I'll give you kind of a roadmap for where we're gonna go in the next couple weeks. Chapter 24 is gonna focus a little bit on Abraham, but Abraham is gonna send off a servant, and it's gonna kind of tell the story of how the servant brings back a wife for Isaac. So Abraham's there, kind of in the background. And then we are going to get into Genesis 25. We're not going to do all Genesis 25. I'm going to go as far as verse 11, because after that we kind of get into the story of other people. I will kind of talk about what happens later in that chapter in Genesis 25, but we're not going to do a full deep dive on that. And one of the things I want to do when we get to the end of that is kind of show comparison of where we started and where we ended up. Where Abraham started geographically, where he ends up geographically, where he starts in terms of his family tree, because we kind of looked at that at the very beginning in Genesis chapter 11, and then what his family becomes by the time of his death, and in the remainder of that chapter 25, and kind of just do maybe a quick recap on his journey in his faith, because every step of the way we see Abraham is pretty much hand in hand doing what God wants him to do. He has a couple missteps, and he never, I don't want to say it never, but he doesn't really seem to understand how God is going to make things happen. And we kind of want to do an overview of that just real quick when we get to that. So we might take 2 or 3 weeks, and then we're going to be done with this study, because I'm not planning to go on with a study of Isaac or study of Jacob. I'm going to stop with Abraham. So if you have a study you would like to do or an idea, I've got a couple. I haven't decided on one, but if you don't tell me what you want, you're going to get something else. So, so if you have an idea, let me know. We'll stop there. We'll begin Genesis 24 next week. Thank you.